On a cold February morning in 1979, 17-year-old Esther Gonzalez kissed her parents goodbye and stepped out into the crisp Beaumont, California air. She was walking just a few blocks to visit her sister, a routine trip she'd made countless times before. But Esther would never reach her destination. Within 24 hours, her body would be discovered in the snow-covered mountains above the San Bernardino National Forest, the victim of a brutal sexual assault and murder that would haunt investigators for nearly half a century. For 45 years, her killer walked free. The case grew cold. Evidence sat in storage, and a family waited for answers that seemed like they might never come. But in November 2024, advanced DNA technology and genetic genealogy would finally reveal a shocking truth. The killer had been hiding in plain sight all along. In fact, he'd been the very person who led police to Esther's body, making an anonymous phone call that investigators now realize was his attempt to control the narrative of his own crime. This is the story of how cutting-edge forensic science brought justice to the Gonzalez family after 45 years of waiting, and how one man's deception finally caught up with him, even from beyond the grave. Call to action. Before we dive deep into this incredible case, I want to take a moment to acknowledge something important. Stories like Esther's deserve to be told, remembered, and shared, so that these victims are never forgotten. If you find these stories as compelling as I do, and if you believe in the importance of keeping these cases in the public eye, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps ensure that stories like Esther's reach the people who need to hear them, and that we can continue honoring the memories of those who were taken too soon. Background context. To understand this case, we need to step back into 1979 Beaumont, California, a small city nestled in the San Bernardino Mountains of Riverside County, about 80 miles east of Los Angeles. This was a tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone, the kind of place where a teenage girl could walk a few blocks to her sister's house without a second thought. Esther Gonzalez was 17 years old, a beloved daughter in a close Mexican-American family that had made Beaumont their home. She was described by those who knew her as responsible, caring, and dependable, the kind of young woman who helped take care of her younger siblings and could always be counted on to show up when she said she would. On February 9, 1979, Esther was planning to visit her sister, who lived just a short walk away through the familiar neighborhoods of Beaumont. It was the kind of winter day that draws people to Southern California, crisp and clear, with snow visible on the distant mountain peaks but mild temperatures in the valley below. The walk to her sister's house was routine, taking Esther through residential streets she'd traveled hundreds of times before. She would cross familiar intersections, pass houses where she knew the families, and arrive at her destination within 15 or 20 minutes at most. But what made February 9, 1979 different was that someone was watching, someone was waiting. Someone who would turn a routine family visit into one of Riverside County's most enduring mysteries. This was also an era when forensic science was in its infancy compared to today's standards. DNA analysis, as we know it, didn't exist. Genetic genealogy was the stuff of science fiction. When investigators collected evidence in 1979, they had no idea that the biological samples they preserved would someday hold the key to solving the case using technology that wouldn't be developed for decades. Timeline of events. The timeline of Esther Gonzalez's disappearance and murder begins on what should have been an ordinary Friday evening. February 9, 1979, started like any other day for the Gonzalez family. Esther spent time at home with her parents, helping with household tasks and caring for her younger siblings. As evening approached, she told her family she was going to walk to her sister's house for a visit, a trip she'd made countless times before without incident. Esther left her parents' Beaumont residence sometime in the early evening when the February sun was beginning to set behind the San Bernardino Mountains. She was dressed for the mild but cool weather, carrying only what she needed for a short visit to family. The route to her sister's house took Esther through quiet residential neighborhoods, past modest homes with well-tended yards and families settling in for the evening. These were streets where children played safely, where neighbors looked out for each other, where a young woman should have been able to walk without fear. But somewhere along that familiar route, Esther's journey was interrupted. Someone approached her. Whether through force, deception, or opportunity, we may never know the exact circumstances. What we do know is that Esther never reached her sister's house that night. When Esther failed to arrive as expected, her family initially wasn't alarmed. Perhaps she'd been delayed or decided to stop somewhere else first. But as hours passed and there was no word from her, concern began to grow. This wasn't like Esther. She was responsible, dependable, the kind of person who would call if her plans changed. By late evening, the family's concern had turned to real worry. They began calling friends and relatives, hoping to find that Esther had simply made an unplanned stop somewhere. They searched the neighborhood, walking the route she would have taken, hoping to find some sign of where she might have gone. As the night wore on, it became clear that this was no ordinary delay. Esther was missing, and something was terribly wrong. The next morning, February 10th, 1979, brought no relief for the anxious family. Esther still hadn't returned home, and there had been no word from her anywhere. The family contacted the Riverside County Sheriff's Department to report her missing, beginning what would become one of the county's longest-running investigations. But even as the family was filing the missing person report, the truth about Esther's fate was about to be revealed in the most disturbing way possible. Sometime that morning, the phone rang at the sheriff's Banning station. An anonymous male caller reported finding the body of a girl near Highway 243, just south of Poppet Flats Road, lying in the snow. The location was remote, a mountainous area above Beaumont where the winter weather had left a covering of snow on the ground. The caller was strangely uncooperative from the beginning. He refused to give his name, wouldn't provide details about how he'd made the discovery, and seemed reluctant to explain why he'd been in such a remote location. When deputies pressed him for more information, he became disagreeable and ended the call abruptly. Deputies immediately responded to the location the caller had described. What they found there would haunt the investigation for decades to come. Esther's body was discovered exactly where the anonymous caller had indicated, lying in the snow in a remote area that was rarely visited, especially in winter weather. The scene told a horrific story. It was immediately clear that Esther had been the victim of a brutal sexual assault. The evidence suggested she had been murdered elsewhere, and her body dumped at this isolated location, chosen specifically because it was unlikely to be discovered quickly. Investigators began processing the scene with the forensic tools available in 1979. They collected physical evidence, including biological samples that would prove crucial decades later. They photographed everything, documented the scene meticulously, and began the painstaking work of trying to understand what had happened to Esther. Investigation. Details. The investigation into Esther Gonzalez's murder began immediately, with deputies focusing on two key leads: identifying the victim and tracking down the anonymous caller who had led them to the body. Esther was quickly identified through the missing person report filed by her family. The confirmation that the body belonged to the missing 17-year-old sent shockwaves through the tight-knit Beaumont community and devastated her family, who had been holding on to hope that she might still be found alive. But investigators were immediately suspicious of the anonymous phone call. The caller's behavior had been strange from the beginning. He was uncooperative, unwilling to provide details, and seemed uncomfortable with the questions deputies asked. His refusal to explain how he'd found the body or why he'd been in such a remote location raised immediate red flags. Working with phone company records and witness interviews, detectives were able to identify the anonymous caller within less than a week. His name was Louis Randolph Williamson, known to friends as Randy. He was a local man who lived in the area and would have been familiar with the remote location where Esther's body was found. When investigators contacted Williamson for questioning, he initially maintained his story about simply finding the body while in the area. But his explanations for being in such a remote location during winter weather were inconsistent and unconvincing. Despite their suspicions, investigators needed evidence to make an arrest. They arranged for Williamson to take a polygraph examination, hoping that the lie detector test might reveal deception or prompt him to confess to involvement in the crime. But here's where the case took an unexpected turn that would frustrate investigators for decades. Williamson passed the polygraph examination. According to the test results, he was telling the truth about finding the body and was not involved in Esther's murder. In 1979, polygraph results carried significant weight in criminal investigations. While not admissible in court, they were often used by investigators to determine whether to continue pursuing a suspect or look elsewhere. Williamson's past polygraph, combined with the lack of other physical evidence connecting him to the crime, led investigators to unofficially clear him as a suspect. However, the experienced detectives working the case were never fully satisfied with this conclusion. Despite the polygraph results, Williamson remained their lead suspect. There were too many unanswered questions. Why had he been in such a remote location? How had he happened to find a body that was hidden from view? Why had he been so uncooperative during the initial phone call? But without DNA technology, investigators in 1979 had limited options for definitively connecting or eliminating suspects. The biological evidence collected from Esther's body was preserved and stored, but the technology to analyze it in a way that could identify an individual perpetrator simply didn't exist yet. As months turned to years, the case grew cold. Investigators continued to follow up on tips and leads, but without new evidence or witnesses, the trail had gone dead. The Gonzalez family was left with unanswered questions and the devastating knowledge that their daughter's killer was still free. Williamson, meanwhile, continued living his life. He eventually moved away from California, relocating to Florida, where he would spend his remaining years. He died in 2014, taking whatever secrets he had to his grave. For 35 years after his death, it seemed like the truth about Esther Gonzalez's murder might never be known. The evidence sat in storage, the case files gathered dust, and the family waited for answers that seemed increasingly unlikely to come. Resolution, current status. The breakthrough in Esther Gonzalez's case came in 2024, 45 years after her murder, through a combination of advancing technology and dedicated cold case investigators who refused to give up. The Riverside County Regional Cold Case Homicide Team, composed of district attorney investigators, sheriff's detectives, and personnel from several other agencies, had been working on Esther's case as part of their systematic review of unsolved murders. These specialized units have been formed across the country specifically to take advantage of new forensic technologies that can solve cases that were impossible to crack in previous decades. The key breakthrough came when investigators learned that Louis Randolph Williamson had died in Florida in 2014, and that a blood sample had been collected during his autopsy in Broward County. This sample had been preserved and was available for analysis. Working with the California Department of Justice's Forensics Laboratory, investigators arranged for DNA to be extracted from Williamson's blood sample. This genetic profile was then compared to DNA that had been recovered from biological evidence collected from Esther's body in 1979 and preserved for over 4 decades. But the case required even more advanced techniques. The DNA evidence was sent to Othram Labs, a private laboratory based in the Woodlands, Texas, that specializes in genetic genealogy research. This cutting-edge technology can identify individuals through DNA even when there's no direct match in criminal databases, by comparing genetic profiles to those of relatives who have submitted DNA to genealogy services. The results were definitive. The California Department of Justice confirmed that Williamson's DNA matched the DNA recovered from Esther's body. After 45 years, investigators finally had the proof they needed to identify her killer. The revelation that Williamson was indeed responsible for Esther's murder vindicated the instincts of the original investigators who had never been fully satisfied with clearing him based on the polygraph results. Their suspicions had been correct all along. The man who had led them to Esther's body was the same man who had killed her. In November 2024, the Riverside County District Attorney's Office publicly announced that the case had been solved, while Williamson could never be prosecuted due to his death 10 years earlier. The identification finally provided the answers that Esther's family had been seeking for nearly half a century. Reflection, impact. The resolution of Esther Gonzalez's case represents both a triumph of modern forensic science and a sobering reminder of how long justice can take. For 45 years, her family lived with unanswered questions, never knowing if her killer was still walking free, still dangerous to other potential victims. This case also highlights the importance of evidence preservation and the dedication of cold case investigators who refuse to let unsolved murders be forgotten. The biological evidence collected in 1979 was carefully stored and maintained for decades, allowing modern technology to finally unlock its secrets. The use of genetic genealogy in this case represents the cutting edge of forensic science, demonstrating how DNA analysis has evolved far beyond simple database comparisons to include sophisticated family tree research that can identify perpetrators even when they've never been arrested or had their DNA collected. For the Beaumont community and Esther's family, the resolution brings a measure of closure, while also serving as a reminder that justice, even when delayed, is still possible. Call to action. 2. 30 seconds. Cases like Esther's remind us why it's so important to keep telling these stories and supporting the investigators who work tirelessly to solve them. Each view, each like, each subscription helps ensure that victims like Esther are remembered and that their stories continue to be told. If this case moved you, if you believe in the importance of justice even when it's delayed by decades, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Together we can make sure that no victim is ever forgotten, and that families like the Gonzalez family know that people still care about getting answers no matter how long it takes. Thank you for watching and for helping to keep Esther's memory alive.